We should probably do some sort of introduction. Like, hi, everybody. I'm Patricia.
I'm Lee.
And we're weird as fuck.
Yeah, I suppose you probably should, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Because someday we might be famous. Okay. So.
So here we go again.
Ah, holy fuck balls, Batman. Okay. So. All right. So we're going to try this again.
This is a cursed episode. This is like the third time we've tried to do this episode. And the recorder keeps saying, no, we don't want you to do this.
I know. We've had, well, that's the second time that our recording has gone funky on us.
I wonder why it doesn't like this show.
It's the Men in Black. Maybe there's something to his story.
Your super secret stories, they're wanting to take it away. You guys to know.
It's even more reason why you should share this episode with your friends. Are you ready to try our cursed episode that we've had to re-record?
Here we go again.
Yeah. The reason why we were late with our Thanksgiving episode. This episode. Okay. So once again, we're going to talk about the story of Al Bielek. I'm just going to pronounce his name that way because I think that's how it's pronounced. It's confusing. It's convoluted. And it's a wild ride. And if it's true, it's one of the most incredible stories you'll ever hear. If not, still a good story. Okay. So according to his own accounts, Al was born Edward Cameron on August 4th, 1916 in Bayshore, Long Island, to two parents who were common law married, but not legally married, which, as we know, is scandalous for 1916.
Shameful.
Shame. Ed was soon joined by a younger brother, Duncan, and they were sent to live with a wealthy aunt on Long Island, where they grew up in relative luxury. And that was great for them because this was right at the end of the First World War and obviously through the Depression as well. So they grew up in relative comfort while the rest of the country was
starved,
going bug nuts. They were intelligent, curious, and excelled in science, which is great and will come into play later on. Ed studied electrical engineering and physics, first at Princeton, and then he received a degree from Harvard. And because of his exemplary performance there, he gained the attention of Dr. John von Neumann, who we talked about before. Dr. von Neumann was a luminary in science at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was responsible for discoveries in computing, atomic energy, quantum theory, game theory, and much more. The list goes on. He really is pretty incredible. He was even one of the principal scientists on the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, which brought an end to World War II. And the deaths of 250,000 people. But that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother time.
Blew the fuck out of everybody.
Twice. So after leaving school with their degrees, Ed and his brother Duncan were recruited by the U.S. Navy to work on top secret projects. And as we know, some of the Navy's top secret projects may have been ineffectual, but they were certainly quite weird.
Yeah, they're pretty much up for anything.
Pretty much. I mean, if Ed was born in 1916, when he got out of college, it would have been the 1940s. And this was the time when they were experimenting with things like remote viewing. The Nazis were into some pretty weird shit too. So pretty much anything was on the table if the U.S. government felt that it would give them a leg up against the enemy during the war. Of course, one of the big projects that the U.S. Navy had at the time was, and this is going to sound really weird, but this actually was a project. They were looking at ways to make their craft invisible to enemy radar. And some sources say, they were looking for ways to make it invisible, period.
Who would not want to do that?
Oh, who wouldn't want to do
Especially in the military.
that? Right. But as we know, that the U.S. government doesn't always do these things with a thought to how they could impact the soldiers and sailors that are part of the project.
Yeah, they just consider them property like the ship.
Well, that's why they call them GIs. They're government issue.
Yep.
They're human property.
Been there, done that. Sucks.
Yeah, not everybody is made for military life.
Not me.
No. You have issues with authority figures.
I'm too stubborn. I don't like people telling me what the fuck to do all the time.
Which makes our relationship that much weirder because I'm bossy as hell and you just go along with it. And I don't know why. So according to Ed, they were looking for ways to make craft invisible and for ways to transport people and heavy equipment through space and time. Now, this sounds really weird, but imagine if it were possible to transport something from the east coast of the United States into a war zone without a delay and without loss of integrity and without the enemy being able to blow you up on the way.
Just the applications for everything would be huge.
Well, at the time, they were more worried about the applications for war, but you know that stuff tends to trickle down to the free market as well.
Eventually.
So Dr. von Neumann recruited Ed, according to his claims, for the project, but in order to do the work, they'd have to relearn everything they thought they knew about physics, including Einstein's unified theory, which Einstein, according to Ed, had completed in order to make the invisibility cloak for the Navy possible. So that is a very controversial idea because according to history, that didn't happen. But according to Ed/Al, it did. And the physics required to make it work were not the physics that we're taught in school.
Makes sense. You know, what we get taught, what's real is always different.
Well, the reality, though, you'd think that if this were true, that other physicists would have come up with
You would think
a similar understanding of the differences between understood physics and potential physics. But if you're a conspiracy theorist, that's just what they want you to believe.
Yeah. Because somebody wants everybody to know, then you would think he would be the first to say, oh, this is right and that's wrong, and give me the big, prize and all the fame that goes with it. But obviously this guy didn't give a shit about that.
Well, and even if that were true, if somebody came and they told you that everything you know about physics is wrong and this is what it really looks like, would you even understand? I wouldn't.
No, they do.
My brain doesn't work that way. My brain functions on fantasy and possibility. It doesn't. Physics hurts my head. So once their education was complete, the brothers went to work on what would eventually become called Project Rainbow in 1939. And we'll get into Project Rainbow in another episode. It's fascinating, but it's also, it's a really heavy one. So it might end up being like a 2 or 3 parter because there's a lot to cover, but it's absolutely fascinating. By September of that year, of the following year, rather, 1940, the project was showing very promising results, and the team creating the field around this had created, apparently, a field around a small Navy tender, rendering it invisible to the naked eye. It was the first successful test, supposedly, of this technology. Now, at this time, this was important because U-boats were wreaking havoc on the U.S. fleet in the Atlantic. I shouldn't say the U.S. fleet, the Allied fleet in the Atlantic. And they'd already taken out several of our ships and several of our Allied ships. And so FDR wanted this done now. FDR, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time. And he ordered a battleship to be retrofitted with the equipment that was necessary to complete the experiment. Because getting our people and our equipment to the front without people dying unnecessarily in the Atlantic was of primary importance. So they decided that an atomic power source was in order because this little Navy tender basically the equipment had been plugged in to make it invisible. And that's not really very workable if you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. So they decided an atomic battery would be necessary. So they set it up. And while waiting for the retrofit, Ed and Duncan were supposed to be reassigned onto the USS Pennsylvania. But they were recalled because the Pennsylvania was headed for Pearl Harbor. And according to Ed/Al and conspiracy theorists who are into this sort of thing, the U.S. government knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. So we all know that on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese fleet attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. Ed and his brother Duncan were supposed to be there on December 5th. So they would have been right in the thick of things. And the government decided they were too valuable and they shouldn't be there. But they also decided not to intervene in the attack because FDR wanted to push America into the war. But American sentiment was very much against it. We were still recovering from the Great Depression. We were still really recovering from the First World War and trying to get back on our feet. And the people in the United States, regardless of what was happening in Europe, did not want to get involved, which I think a huge mistake, but that's just me. Well, it's not just me, but, huge mistake. So FDR, according to the conspiracy theory, knew that this was going to happen and decided to let it go because he knew that an attack on American soil would push public sentiment in the other direction.
So let all those people die. What the fuck? They're only soldiers.
2,400 people died at Pearl Harbor as a result of this attack. Now, if you believe that conspiracy theory, then yeah.
You think if they know it, they would have moved some ships out and not had
our
all
fleet
those
crippled?
ships decimated. I mean, there was a lot of ships in there.
Yeah, I mean, the Arizona,
That's why I find
obviously,
it hard to believe, because if they knew about it, they would have moved some guys' ships out and not be decimated like that.
And to me, that's the number one argument against the conspiracy theory, because if we wanted to become involved in the Second World War and FDR was dedicated to bringing American sentiment on board, but still actually having a fighting force that could react, they would have had to have moved some of those ships because that really crippled us for quite a while.
Yeah, that was a shitload of ships.
Yeah. So obviously, Ed and Duncan, they came out of this okay. They stayed on the East Coast. And during the next 18 months, the Navy retrofitted the USS Eldridge with the equipment that was needed to turn it invisible and transport it through space and time.
Make it go poof, poof.
So, and I say that a lot. So, as I find my place in the... Please just edit that part out, people. If you just skip ahead 15 seconds, it's fine. Anyway, on the 13th of August, 1943, work was finally complete and they were able to do their first experiment. And according to witnesses, it didn't quite go to plan. The experiments were carried out and apparently it rendered the ship invisible, with some witnesses saying that they saw a green glowing fog where the craft had once floated. But the human side effects were extreme. So there were stories of seamen disappearing, people going insane, and people even reappearing embedded in part of the ship's superstructure.
Yep, that's where the movie came from.
Exactly. So if you've ever seen, in the 1980s, there was a movie called The Philadelphia Experiment. And it kind of goes through some of this. And that actually comes into this later. But the Navy, of course, denies all of this.
Of course.
And claims that this is just an extraordinary experiment, extraordinary story. And I'll probably cover the Philadelphia Experiment at some point. Right now, we're not going to go too deeply into it because that's a whole nother rabbit hole.
It was just a weather balloon or a flare.
No, it never happened. According to the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Navy, it never happened. But we're going to get to that too. So I'm going to skip over this next part because it's in the blog post. You can read it. You're not going to care about it. And I don't want this to get too long because last time we recorded it was like an hour.
Yeah, it was a long one.
And I'm pretty sure there was snoring in it, so this will be better. According to Ed, the experiment was designed to create a cloak of invisibility around the ship. Instead, it created a time vortex. So the ship, which is how people ended up embedded in portions of the ship, they moved, the boat didn't. If that makes sense?
Yeah.
And so when it rematerialized, they were in a new position, which unfortunately wasn't a good position. So Ed and Duncan had set up and initiated the experiment only to notice. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. So even though these terrible things happened to these sailors, the government decided, hey, that's good enough.
It worked.
We can make this work. Let's try again. Unfortunately, they didn't calibrate the equipment properly for the second experiment. It sounds like, according to Ed, they didn't calibrate it at all. They just basically plugged it in and said, hey, let's do it again. And it went badly. So Ed and his brother Duncan were on the boat when the experiment was initiated, and they noticed that something really strange was happening to the air around them. It was charged. It was electrically charged. They noticed sort of a swirling cloud around them. And being reasonable men, they didn't want to become one with the ship. And so they jumped overboard. But rather than hitting the water, Ed says they found themselves suspended. And then they blacked out. And when they woke up, they found themselves in a hospital, but it was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. They were suffering from radiation burns and radiation sickness, and they were plugged into machines that used light and sound waves as opposed to any sort of chemical drip like we would necessarily use now. He said the room was very high tech and very futuristic and didn't appear to be a hospital room in the US in the 1940s. Alarmed, he asked the medical staff what had happened to them and where were they, and was told that rather than being 1943, they were in the year 2137. No telling how they'd been found in the bay, or if they were found in the bay, or where they found them, or how they found them, only that they had been found severely burned and taken to hospital. The tale that Ed told after that was pretty incredible. He claims that due to widespread war and climate change, the world's governments had been destabilized, and much of the once heavily populated coastal region of the U.S. and presumably other locations across the globe. His story really only details what happened in America. Apparently that was his focus. They were completely underwater. So the Mississippi River was now more than a mile wide. Almost all of Florida was gone. Much of the eastern seaboard and the west coast of the United States were also gone. And the city of, for example, Bend, Oregon, you're familiar with Bend, Oregon, was just a few miles from the ocean. Right now, we know that Bend is a full day's drive at highway speeds from the ocean. It's quite a ways
away from the ocean.
According to Ed, there was a war that occurred in 2005. Thankfully, we know that didn't happen. When the U.S. and Europe came together to defeat communist Russia in a massive battle that resulted in the deaths of billions of people and reduced the total population of the earth to roughly about 300 million people. Now, by comparison, in 2020, the United States population is about 335 million people. So imagine everybody on Earth, the population of the U.S. That's fewer than there were in the year 1000.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people gone. And as a result, it was chaotic. Rather than having centralized governments, we had tribes, and martial law was the law of the land. But that wasn't it. For reasons that Ed doesn't really make clear, he was propelled even further into the future, this time to 2749. There, he discovered a nearly utopian society. So apparently by this point, we'd gotten over tribal warfare.
Got our heads out of our asses.
Well,
Maybe.
Had our heads forcefully pulled out of our asses by artificial intelligence. So basically, we were ruled by a computer overlord that telepathically communicated to us what our activities for the day would be. People no longer used money. Your existence basically was exchanged for credits. I don't know whether people had, like day jobs, or if it were like it is now, where you go to work and you trade a certain number of hours out of your day for a certain amount of money. But they had credits that they could use to buy the things that they need. And this isn't to say that it was a classless society, because this society where Ed found himself in 2749 had cities that the AI controlled. So these were cities that were floating above the landscape. We had apparently conquered gravity by this point. Yes. And these floating cities would be repositioned regularly. So it wasn't like if you were German, you lived in Germany, you might be in Germany today and Spain tomorrow, and which actually would be kind of cool, I think. If you were a citizen of the world rather than being, some tribal beast. But not everybody lived in these floating cities. Some people still lived on the ground in homes down there. So apparently class is still a thing, which is awesome. So like I said, it was all ruled over by an AI that was responsible for every aspect of the resident's life. They claimed that the machine was so effective at keeping humanity in line that there were no wars and no need for a central government. People just let the machine tell them what to do.
Sounds like fun. Not.
Well, it strikes me as, were humans selectively bred to be somehow less violent and less argumentative than where our natures necessarily are?
Maybe.
Are you looking at the recording? It's looking a little weird.
Yeah, it turned white.
Why is yours all white?
I don't know.
We better talk fast or this one's going to go corrupt again. So Ed stayed in this utopian society for a couple of years, apparently working as a tour guide. Of what? I have no idea.
For a majorly intelligent guy, you would think that he would not be doing that.
For such an intelligent guy, but he's, 700 years from the past?
Yeah, he might not be so smart there.
Right. And I wonder, as a tour guide, don't you have to have some knowledge about your surroundings? What could he possibly know that he would be able to share with people?
Well, most tour guides, you get trained.
Well, you have a script.
So all he has to do is learn the scripts and do the tours.
Maybe it was a museum and he was like part of
shit.
the living history exhibit.
Yeah, that would be a good one for him.
So after a couple of years of doing this, Ed was, for reasons he doesn't elaborate on, shuffled back to 2137 to pick up his brother. And then together they were flung back in time to 1984. Why the mid-80s? I don't know. There they met with Dr. von Neumann again. Now, this is where a lot of skeptics start pointing fingers, because Dr. von Neumann died in the 50s. So you couldn't have met him in the 80s.
Unless he could travel in time.
Or if he didn't really die. So that's what, the skeptics say. No, he was still alive. To which I respond, no, he was really dead. But that's just me. So Dr. von Neumann met with the young men and told them that the whole time travel thing, the whole Philadelphia experiment, the whole shebang was a horrible mistake. And it had led to the wars and the other things that Ed had seen in the future. And he gave them a mission. Go back to 1943, stop it, make sure it never happens again. And so they were shuffled back to 1943, back to the Eldridge, where, of course, they were successful, which is why you've never heard of it, because they stopped it.
Uh-huh.
Are you confused yet?
It kind of makes sense. If you can travel through time and it fucked everything up, then you'd want to go back to where it started and
unfuck it.
Unfuck it up.
Well, now things are going to get weird. Yeah, that wasn't the weird part. Okay, so Ed states that after they disrupted this experiment, the brothers continued to work in classified projects for the military, including the hydrogen bomb project at Los Alamos. But Ed was very outspoken, and he was less willing to play along with the plans that the military had for him because he'd seen how badly they'd screwed things up. He questioned not only their policies, but also the viability of some of the projects that he was on, proclaiming, he says, that the lead scientist, Dr. Teller, knew that the devices that they were working on were too unstable, the hydrogen bomb project, and too dangerous to be used. Instead, they posed a massive threat to anyone using it and were unviable. Because of his outspoken nature, he believes he was separated from his family and relocated to Washington, D.C. in 1947. I worked with a guy like that. I was telling you about him this morning. Really outspoken. They decided, we don't need you.
Yeah, get rid of you.
Mm-hmm. The military advised him after his forced separation from his family that he could continue to work with them, but he couldn't see his family again. He doesn't recall why, but the argument that they made was sufficient for him to drop the issue and remain on the East Coast. So he's a little fuzzy on why he agreed to abandon his family.
But he was okay with it. See ya.
Bye.
Didn't want to deal with you guys anyway, so fuck it. Bye.
You all suck. Yeah. Woohoo. During the years that he was on the East Coast, he was instrumental as an observer on the Mach 1 project, where he worked closely with Chuck Yeager and Jack Ridley. Now, remember, all of this is his story. He's not really able to bring up any documentation to prove it. I'm just telling you his story. He and Jack Ridley would later work on and perfect the first successful ion propulsion engine. After successfully testing the engine, Ed's father, Alexander Duncan Cameron, would step in with the funding they needed and the contacts to put the device into full production for commercial use. Ed says this dismayed a powerful group that wished to keep the technology under wraps and under control for themselves. It was decided then that Ed was too much of a liability and too dangerous to continue in the field that he was in, as he was. He was rounded up by special agents. Hold on to your butts, it's about to get strange. And taken by train to the Pentagon, where he was debriefed. He doesn't know what happened at the Pentagon. He doesn't recall. Oops. Hold on. Just lost my place. But he remembered being taken to McLean, Virginia, and then sent by portal to Alpha Centauri, where he was debriefed by aliens. Are they aliens if they're on their planet? I don't think so. I think at this point he was the alien. But
hopefully it wasn't anal probed.
There's a lot of holes in Ed's story. Anything could have happened. He was then taken to Montauk and regressed back to infancy. That's right. They made him baby Ed again and placed in the care of the Bielek family in the year 1927. So, okay, if you're following our timeline, in 1927, Ed Cameron was 11, but Al Bielek was a 9-month-old infant. And that's where the research started to get really confusing. So he states, we're going to call him Al now. Al states that his earliest memories of this incarnation as the 9-month-old were at a holiday party with his quote-unquote parents. He says that he remembers the conversation very clearly and understood every word that was being spoken. That was his first indication that something was very wrong. As he grew up, he was known as the walking encyclopedia. He was able to outpace his peers and excel in all things academic. He graduated from high school with a really high score in an electronics exam that was given in the school, something that none of his peers passed. And this drew the attention of the U.S. Navy. Yep, the Navy's getting involved again.
But wouldn't they already know it if they're the ones that put him in a baby and started his life over?
Well, if you believe his story, he was being monitored by the U.S. Navy, and that's how they knew that he did so well on the exam and that he could be useful again. So this time, however, the Navy did not involve Al in any of their classified projects.
Fuck too much shit up.
Exactly, Al, you got a big mouth. They did, however, after his military service, wrangle him into some PSYOPs programs that they were working on at as part of the Montauk Project. So the Montauk Project, as we've talked about before, was the inspiration for Stephen King's The Mist and the program Stranger Things. So you know the story of 11.
Yep. Awesome show.
Really an awesome show. Al states that this was, of course, very hush-hush, and no one would know that he was part of his program. So rather than relocate him from his current residence in California to Montauk, New York, yeah, it's about to get weird again, he caught the underground hypersonic train that would take him there after his day job. So Al worked a day job, took a train to New York, worked, turned back around, came back to California. One would assume napped, maybe slept on the train, I don't know, and then worked his day job in California. This went on until a time tunnel that would allow him to travel instantly between locations was perfected.
Why the fuck would you want to do that? If you're that smart, you'd want to just stay where the advanced stuff is and not work a job and then work another job.
Well,
fuck that shit.
His reasoning behind it was that they had to keep his involvement in these projects very hush-hush, so no one could know. So he had to work the two jobs to cover up that he was working Montauk.
Mm.
So apparently, according to Al, he continued in this pattern well into the 1970s, eventually working his way into a position as program director for psychics.
Uh-huh.
That sounds like fun. Which gave him some influence over the Montauk Boys. And now the Montauk Boys is where we get the story of 11 in Stranger Things. So basically children who were kidnapped and used as experimental pawns. They were trying to develop children who could become telepathic, who could be remote viewers, who were telekinetic.
Yeah.
And apparently only boys are capable of this. If you have a uterus, your brain is useless to the U.S. military.
And this surprises you how?
It doesn't. It pisses me off. Because
yes.
Fuck you. Now, the interesting thing about this is that during the course of all of this, Al became well acquainted with Duncan Cameron, Ed Cameron's younger brother, who is now older than Al. I'm not going to go into that because it hurts my brain. Duncan had no memory of any of that, or no realization that Al was in any way associated with him. And Al didn't remember Duncan until much later. But they worked together on this program, attempting to make super brain-powered kids. In the 1980s, the space-time program was in operation, and in addition to his normal routines, Al and Duncan were also charged with making use of the portal device, which sent them to, get this, Mars and other planets in search of light and dark energy, as well as research stations positioned on Earth at 1000 BCE and 6037 CE. So way in the past, way in the future. It wasn't these experiences, however, that rocked Al's sense of time. It was the 1988 movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, that we mentioned earlier. When he saw that, he began to have recollections of his time with Project Rainbow and the USS Eldridge. He believes that his recollections and the revelations they prompted led to him being dismissed from the Montauk Project. Over time, and through meetings with such past members of his inner circle, including his brother Duncan, who, interestingly enough, Duncan Cameron does exist, and that's a whole nother story that we'll get into at another time. He claims that he believes that Al Bielek really is his brother Ed Cameron. Whether this is a shared psychosis or reality, it's really difficult to say.
Yeah, it's getting all convoluted and weird.
Yeah, like I said, it took me a while to sort of pull these threads out so I could make something sort of cohesive and understandable out of it. It's really twisted up. And I'm just skimming the surface in this. You could really go down a rabbit hole on this and spend an entire season talking just about Al Bielek and Ed Cameron and the projects that they were involved in. In 1989, Al began speaking openly about the experiences that he had. So he talked to anybody and everybody who would listen. He spoke at conferences. He spoke on, I think they did have him on Coast to Coast, the radio show that talks about paranormal and when we've watched Ancient Aliens,
Yeah.
the host of that show has been on there quite a few times. He spoke as much as he could to anyone that he could about the experiments that he'd been part of with the U.S. military. And according to Al, the government desires the power that comes with these projects for obvious reasons. And through his process and extensive alien contact that's been ongoing since the 1940s, they've placed themselves in a position of authority in the universe. So the U.S. government, according to Al, has made themselves a point of contact with alien species throughout the universe that help us to advance our technology. He uses this to explain why we've had such leaps in technology over the last 100 years. But, of course, the U.S. government decries any knowledge, calls Al a complete crack, and says that this is a figment of a fevered brain or of overactive imagination.
Of course.
And, Al passed away in 2011, so we can't really ask him. We can review his recordings and see what he has to say. His story was remarkably consistent throughout his life, from the time that he started talking until he passed. And there are quite a few people that he's made connections with that he claims were originally part of his inner circle, including Duncan Cameron, as I said, and Preston Nichols and others, who say that, yes, there is some truth to what he's saying, that things like the experiment on the Eldridge and Project Rainbow were in fact a thing. But because of the government's power and the government's ability to control the flow of information that's coming and going, they don't have a way to prove it.
You think he would have stashed some of that stuff away for his own proof?
One would think.
So he wouldn't look like he was a nut.
One would think. But true, not true. Either way, it's a pretty amazing story.
Yeah. Some people that are very intelligent don't have a lot of common sense.
This is true. So there you have it. The story of Al Bielek. You stayed awake this time. Well done.
Yeah.
You look like you could use a little more caffeine, though.
Yep. I could use a pop.
So there are many things in here that we are going to cover at a later point. I'd love to cover Montauk more. Project Rainbow.
Rainbow.
Yeah. The whole nine. But for now, I just wanted to touch on Al Bielek. I've been talking for 36 minutes on just this, skirting the surface of this one topic. Like I said, you could really go down a rabbit hole on this. But for now, I'm going to leave it there before our audio gets corrupted again.
Like us, follow us.
And check out the show notes for links to all of the sources that we used on this story and all our others. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye. Want to stay connected between shows? You can find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCKPodcast. Send us an email at weirdasfckpodcast@gmail.com, or come on over to our website at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, pick up some merch, look over our sources, and even share your weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird.